Listeners, readers, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I'm Kimberly Ford, one-time adjunct professor, Berkeley best-selling author, and PhD in literature. I'm also someone, I'm going to be super honest with you guys, I am someone who had kidney surgery within the week. Just within the last, 6 days. And I'm convalescing. I was told to take it easy. The surgery was great. It was totally fine. It was a birth defect that finally, when I was 55 years old, reared its cute/ugly head, and went ahead and took care of it. One and done. Everything's fine. But I'm supposed to be really taking it easy. And yet I feel so strongly about Dolly Alderton's good material that I suited up, and here I am to discuss it with you today. I'm also going to be very honest about how I approached this book. I would see it on these, front tables of all of the independent bookstores, and there was something about the cover, honestly, I think it was the shirts holding hands that really, I was like, oh God, no, thank you. I also am not sure that all the bright colors, in my mind, did it a lot of favors. And I'm also kind of a hot take. I'm going to say that the Nora Ephron thing, the comparison with Nora Ephron on the cover, all of that led me to believe that it was a bit of a lightweight in terms of, literary substance. So I was a little bit reluctant. People were saying it was great. And I was like, oh, good. Okay. But, not really thinking that I was going to take it all that seriously. And then, make of this what you will. Then it came out in the New York Times top 10 books of 2024, one of the many lists that came out recently. And I will say that the fact that it came out in the company of All Fours by Miranda July, James by Percival Everett, and You Dreamed of Empires by Álvaro Enrigue. Those were like the first 4 books that were on the list. So the 3 of them and Dolly Alderton. And I was like, whoa, okay, those 3 books were just incredibly, incredibly important to me in the past year. They were incredibly innovative, both in terms of message and in terms of form. And I was like, golly, like if we're putting Dolly Alderton in this company, then definitely this is a book that I need to check out. So not only was I interested in the book because it was on this list, which I feel like, I don't know if that's snobby, I'm not sure what that is, but the stamp of approval from the New York Times apparently is very salient for me. The other thing is when I went to my local bookstore here in California, there was one of those little notes that, some bookseller, one of the amazing and wise and very well-read people in Kepler's here in Menlo Park, had a little note, and it was talking about how this good material had a double ending. And honestly, that kind of structural innovation, although sometimes it can feel very gimmicky, to me it's very appealing. I immediately was like, oh, wait, maybe she's doing something that's structurally innovative, and maybe that's going to be really interesting to me. I don't always need, some sort of incredible structural innovation or something that's kind of newfangled. In fact, lots of times I really appreciate a very traditional text in terms of structure and in terms of all of the kind of basic elements. But I was interested in the idea of what seems a bit like a rom-com, that there would be some sort of structural element. So I was really drawn in by this idea about the close, which we will get to. But as I was reading, I was really enjoying myself. Throughout the entire thing, I was very impressed with the elements that we are about to get to. But it wasn't until the very end, I will argue that it is not, in fact, a double ending. But it wasn't until I got to the end and there was kind of this turn in the last, 75 pages, that I was so incredibly impressed. And the thing that is going to run through this entire talk today is this idea of the message in this book being so important. So I'm a 55-year-old woman. I literally, when I was tiny, I had to pay my best friend to play house because I loved playing house so much. I had to pay her a quarter. Thank you, Laura, for all of those hours of playing house with me back in the day. But I was just desperate, even as a tiny child, to sort of have a family and to play house. And largely, I feel like a lot of my life is essentially playing house. So that dream has come true for me. But I do wonder, and certainly as I am looking at this generation of younger women coming up, I do wonder what it would have been like for me if instead of When Harry Met Sally, I was exposed to more people who were making choices, more women, very pointedly, who were making choices that were not domestic and were not traditional and were not all about these roles, that women of my generation, I graduated high school in 87, we were expected both to become a doctor, but also, to be an incredible homemaker and a wife and a mother. It was a high bar. But I'm very serious when I say that this kind of text would have been very meaningful for me. I really would, with such a compelling set of characters and such an immersive kind of atmosphere, I think I really would have been deeply affected by this idea that like you could actually just not get married and you could go off to South America for a year and you could not have plans and you could be very successful in the business world and then make choices, that drew you away from that in ways that were very meaningful, all while being single. I think that this would have been a watershed moment for me. It was not something that I was exposed to back in the day. And I really, really think it is valuable. So I'll say right now that every one of these books, all fours in terms of its look at women's sexuality, and for a while it was being called the great perimenopausal novel. So, it was a novel that in fact had a very feminist and a very strong message for people. Same with James. We have this rewriting of Huckleberry Finn that was both, sort of innovative in terms of its language and in terms of the point of view, but also one that had a really important message about race. And we also have You Dreamed of Empires, which was incredibly important in terms of talking about the meeting of these two empire builders, Hernán Cortés with Moctezuma. All three of those, by the way, I have lectures on. So if you haven't seen those and you're interested, go check out the Foxed page, either on YouTube or your podcast. Those lectures were so fun to do. I mean, those books are incredible. But in all of those, there was a message that lingered with me and that really made me do some reassessing in some very important ways. And the most important way in which I think good material belongs in the company of these literary luminaries is this message. So I'm going to give Dolly Alderton, full credit in terms of having written a book that has an extremely important and persuasive and really foundational message. For those of you who like an agenda, we're going to dive in. We're going to talk about the title briefly. We're going to look at the cover art. We're going to talk about the opening of the book. Then we're going to talk about this idea of the male narrative. I was very interested, and she is so good at it. We're going to take a look at that. We're also going to take a look at the prose a little bit more widely. We're going to look at some of these Britishisms, which I loved. We're going to look at figurative language pretty briefly. And then we're going to look at the idea of foils in the novel. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the ending. And then finally, I am going to hit you guys with a totally hot take. I mean, honestly, it's so crazy. It's crazy. It's crazy. I'm gonna make a very kind of huge statement about this book at the end, and I don't know that anyone has made this statement so far, and I'm actually very proud of it and pleased. So if you don't have time to listen to this whole thing, maybe zip to the end and let me know if you agree or disagree with this gigantic stance that I'm going to take on the novel. Okay, we're going to go ahead and dive in. I liked the title. I thought the title was really good. Good material obviously refers to the fact that, as a comedian, our Andy is accumulating good material. And there is a really very sweet part at the end when we are in Jen's perspective. The idea of Jen's perspective is making me realize that I should warn you guys. I'm going to talk about the book in its entirety. They're not going to be a lot of plot spoilers, but certainly I am going to talk about the form of the book, and that's in some ways kind of a giveaway of certain elements. So at the end, Jen, after she has seen his stand-up thing, says something like, you could have written a letter, and he's like, why waste good material? And I love that. Those of you who've listened to the Fox page for a long time know that I get a little frisson when we have the mention of a title in the text of a novel. And in that case, it was such a poignant and significant and sort of perfect time to bring it up, and it was very sweet, and I really liked that. Also, I think good material speaks to this idea of is someone marriage material, or are they, husband material, or are they wife material? So I think there is kind of a nice nuance to it. I think it's a good title. I don't think it's like a crazy amazing title, but I do think it's good. In terms of the cover art, I tipped my hand a bit earlier. I'm not that wild about it. It also, for some reason, spoke to me. It reminded me of Lessons in Chemistry, which was a book I liked fine, but this book, Good Material, in many ways for me kind of belongs in a slightly different category. So I didn't really, I wasn't loving the cover art and these kinds of squares and maybe the color scheme itself. And I will tell you, I really was not wild about the shirts holding hands. Again, to me, that was just so cheeseball. And it also underscored a part of the book that was not my favorite. So we're going to just go ahead and dive in so that we're going to get quickly to this, the part where the shirts are holding hands. So when we open the book, we're going to move very briefly past the dedication for Laura Benstead. I actually have been listening to Dolly Alderton's memoir, Everything I Know About Love, and it is so delightful and so good. And she's, I think in the beginning, I've just cracked it. I'm only a few essays in. It's definitely worthwhile. But I'm assuming that this Lauren is a longtime girlfriend. Also, in the acknowledgments, Alderton makes a lot about the fact that her girlfriends, are just absolutely crucial in terms of the quality of her life. Then we move on and we have this delightful thing called A Scattering by Christopher Reid that is about the elephant bones. And I liked this. I thought it was fine. It was a bit long for me, which that sounds kind of weird, but an epigraph, I don't know. I got kind of bogged down and I was a little like, okay, let's move on. I liked the idea of it. It didn't add a tremendous amount to me, but I did appreciate the echo of it toward the end. And I liked the fact that this book that wasn't exactly a self-help book, but more of a kind of grieving book, was seen sort of throughout the novel. Then we have the dates. So summer 2019, Dolly Alderton is very careful throughout to give us this structure, this chronology. And honestly, when an author starts giving me a chronology like that, my expectation is that they're going to do something kind of crazy with time, and that did not happen. So I guess I felt a little like I was kind of primed for something to happen and then it didn't happen. It didn't really bother me that we had this chronological marking as we moved through. But I think on some level it raised an expectation for me that wasn't quite met, although it didn't really bother me. Then we have this list in the beginning, Reasons It's Good I'm Not With Jen. This is a book that has a lot of lists. It has emails, it has notes, it has texts. They're in different fonts. They're formatted in different ways. The indentation is different. I'm not like a huge fan of that. I think it's fine. But again, recently when I was listening to the essays by Dolly Alderton, there was one in the beginning that was very interesting. My understanding is, she was born in 1988. According to her memoir, she grew up essentially in suburbs, that were sort of not too far, and then they moved and they were a little further away from London. But she grew up, I believe, without any brothers and went to an all-girls school until the end of what we would think of as high school. So for her, boys were kind of these exotic creatures throughout her entire life. And the way that she learned about them was through MSN Messenger, I think, which would have been like maybe our AOL or something. But there was a lot of like emailing. And she talked a lot about the importance of being able to correspond with these boys in these very carefully crafted, sort of missives. So there is a lot. You can imagine that as a young person, and as someone who ended up being an incredibly popular and very well-developed writer, that this early correspondence with young men would have involved a lot of word crafting. And you see that throughout in terms of the letters back and forth and the texts. And, she and friends would send lists of songs and music. And it looks like she did a lot of like journaling and stuff. So I imagine that this idea of Reasons Why It's Good I'm Not With Jen, this is the kind of, in some ways, the lifeblood of the young Dolly Alderton. And it's also very revealing. I also liked the idea, a couple of therapists bring it up that, if you're getting divorced, it might not be a bad idea to write down all the reasons, depending on the nature of the divorce, to write down all of the reasons why you loved that person, to remind yourself, or in some cases to write down all the reasons you are not with someone after a breakup. There's some kind of handy, very like tactical things in this book that I appreciated. So we have this list. When I have a list at the beginning of a book like this, I actually find it a bit hard to kind of contextualize and to hold on to. I think it's the reason why sometimes lists don't really speak to me. In this case, I don't really know who the I is. We have Reasons Why It's Good I'm Not With Jen. I don't know who this I is, and I don't really have a great picture of Jen. And these little snapshots certainly are building an image of her, but it's not, for me, it's not the most very effective way to get someone across. I like a list a little later when I have a little more context for it. But so we move through the lists and we get to Friday, 5th of July, 2019. And here we have this. This is kind of the like proper opener of the novel. There is a jumper and a shirt hanging on the washing line in my mom's garden that looks like they're holding hands in the breeze. I stand at my bedroom window and watch their interplay change with the direction of the wind. I watch until exactly 7:03 p.m. when I pick up the phone to the woman I've loved for 3 years, 10 months, and 29 days, who dumped me and smashed my heart like a sinewy piñata 8 days and 22 hours ago. So this is, I mean, I'm going to be kind of harsh here. I don't think this is the very, very best example of the writing that Dolly Alderton shows throughout this entire novel. There are a couple of reasons for that. It seems a tiny bit twee, this idea of having counted all of the days. And I mean, obviously that's speaking to the pain in which our Andy is living these days. But there's something about it that does seem to me like a tiny bit cheeseball. And then we're going to talk later about her figurative language being great. A lot of her figurative language is metaphor and simile. And this idea of smashed my heart like a sinewy pinata. Sinewy pinata to me just did not, it just didn't work, didn't really work. And when you have a pinata, sort of, that would have worked, I guess. Okay. But we're going to talk a little bit later about why certain metaphors and similes work so well, and a lot of hers do, and why some of them don't. So in many cases, the use of metaphor and simile, like that kind of figurative language, that's the sort of thing that can make writing feel a bit more literary. But it's also something you have to be very careful with. I mean, by no means do you have to use a lot of like figurative language in order to have your book be amazing. And in fact, I am a real stickler when it comes to it. And I think a lot of the time it sort of backfires on people and makes their work seem, in fact, less compelling. But I want to get back to this idea of this the jumper and the shirt holding hands. So I just found it a little bit cheeseball. And again, leaning into it pretty hard here on the cover art sort of underscored it. And I have to say, I kicked off the book with a little bit of reservation. Very happily, all of that reservation dissipated very quickly. But I will say that this is a book that got much, much better over time. So we're going to dive now into this idea of the male narrator. A lot has been made of the fact that Dolly Alderton is so good, and I absolutely agree with that. The way that she inhabits and voices Andy is so compelling. And the reason why I know that is the fact is lots of times I would just sort of forget, and I was so kind of immersed in Andy. I mean, which is the way it should be, obviously. And on some level, it's weird that we're even having to talk about this. I don't love the idea of kind of like gender in fiction, but I also think it's undeniable. I mean, good material by Dolly Alderton, and I think her oeuvre in general, is something that is going to be read, I would imagine, more by women than by men. I mean, I think sales bear that out. It's in some ways, it's just sort of a fact. But it is less common to have a woman voicing a male narrator, certainly one that is, the protagonist of the novel, who is the main character, and who is speaking in the first person for almost the entirety of the novel. That is somewhat unusual, and she pulls it off so well. I want to compare it quickly with All Fours by Miranda July. So that is a novel where it is also told in the first person. It is a woman, and it is obviously a female writer. And Miranda July spoke pretty candidly in interviews about the fact that she was really leaning into this phenomenon where readers, if they have a novel written by a woman and it's in the first person, I did this and I did that, people will automatically assume that there are a lot of autobiographical elements. And Miranda July really leaned into that, and she spoke about leaning into it. She was really playing with this idea of sort of the division between fact and fiction, between author and protagonist. And I really loved that. I love the idea of sort of interrogating the narrative stance and sort of which ways it is functioning or not functioning. So Dolly Alderton is doing something very, very different, which is that she's creating an enormous amount of space between the author and the protagonist. No one is going to confuse Andy. And almost in some ways, I think it's so successful that you're not even really tempted to think that she's using a lot of her own experiences. I mean, you can imagine her using maybe, boyfriend's experiences or friends' experiences. And she talks in the acknowledgments about how important, all of these discussions that she had with her guy friends were in terms of being able to voice Andy. She's incredibly, incredibly good at it. So the one thing that I will say about this, again, is this comparison on the front of the book, that it says, like Nora Ephron with a British twist, delightful. So the idea of it being like Nora Ephron, the comparison being made there is underscored in the acknowledgments, because Dolly Alderton says that Nora Ephron made this incredible film by having interviewed Rob Reiner. The film that she is referring to, I'm assuming, is When Harry Met Sally. And that is a film that I loved. But it is a film, which means that when Nora Ephron was writing that, she was then going to put it into the voice and the body and the persona of Billy Crystal. It's it is much easier, I'm going to venture to say, to convince an audience of a male voice if you literally have a man in front of the audience speaking the words that you have written. It is much harder to do what Dolly Alderton has done, which is convince the reader that this is a male mind that we are dwelling in for 300 pages. And she never makes a misstep. It's so well done. And I feel like the Nora Ephron thing is sort of diminishing what she has done. It's also, I mean, I'm 55 years old, and When Harry Met Sally, I loved that movie, but it seems really old. It feels in some ways like kind of a false comparison or a non-favorable comparison where this book is concerned. And the most important thing I would say in terms of the Nora Ephron comparison is that When Harry Met Sally is your totally typical rom-com. I mean, it has everything to do with like heterosexual love, and it has everything to do with all of these cisgender people, you know, meeting when they're young and then sort of having these incredibly, like fulfilling and I would say kind of rarefied romantic experiences. That is not what Dolly Alderton is doing. In fact, she is really subverting the whole marriage plot. And we're going to get to that. Actually, we're going to get to it right now. So back in the day, like even in Shakespeare, the definition of a comedy, so think of ancient theater, think of Shakespeare, think of Jane Austen, all of those were a comedy if they ended in a marriage. That's literally the definition. Tragedy if it ends in, death, obviously. But this idea of a comedy versus a tragedy, there's this very, very narrow definition, and it is still shocking to me that definition has to do with marriage. So in the rom-com, which is this very, sort of codified genre that we've had for a long, long time. The whole goal is, for a woman to meet a man and to marry him and be sort of happily ever after. And we've seen some really excellent subversions of it. There was that movie Bros, which was kind of like the male rom-com with Billy Eichner, which I loved that movie. Or there was that incredible spoof of the rom-com with Rebel Wilson. So I think there's been a lot of like pushing against the genre. But even the fact that I can think of like two very specific examples that push against the rom-com and the marriage plot really shows us how entrenched this is. I think it's changing, and it's changing obviously very quickly. But it's very important to me that people kind of recognize that this is like the opposite of Nora Ephron. This is like the opposite of When Harry Met Sally. And yes, I mean, I guess maybe taking on a male persona is the thing. And maybe Nora Ephron, maybe they did some study and I know that in fact that's like a very effective comparison to make. But in my literary brain, it's really sort of doing a bit of a disservice. The last thing I will say about this idea of taking on the male character is that it reminded me so much of Fleischman is in Trouble. That was the first novel by Taffy Brodesser-Akner. I loved that book. And we had a similar thing there where we had a turn at the end of the novel and it sort of upended the whole thing. But I loved that character. I actually, I watched the television series with a lot of anticipation. And I really felt like something was kind of lost because we didn't have the voice of Toby Fleischman. So I think it's maybe told in the third person, but it's very closely told, so we get a sense of how Toby is feeling. But Toby is certainly the protagonist, and we are certainly sort of in his point of view, and it's masterfully done, and I really loved it. So it's a bit similar in that we have, this male point of view for a long time, and then it sort of switches toward the end. Both of them, I think, do it incredibly well, but it's telling that, there are two very specific examples of this that I can think of. It's something that is not widely done. In fact, should be done much more widely and I think much more freely. But Alderton has just an incredibly well-wrought male narrative. And there were a couple of specific things that I made note of at the back of my book in terms of this male narrator. One is just, in general, the tone. Throughout, the tone is amazing. The language, the verbiage, it's so good. But on page 166, there was this incredible comment about therapy. So he has a whole thing about making up a fake name in order to find a therapist, which I think it's such that weird male thing. Maybe this is also, hopefully it's more British than American, but that like weird thing about men not doing therapy, I think is super crazy. All you men out there listening, I actually do. I'm so pleased. Hello, all my male listeners out there. A lot of male listeners, and I'm going to tell you that if you're a male listener listening to my thing about good material, and you've ever attempted to get therapy, or you really just want to like live a better life, then go out there and get yourself some therapy. So our Andy, though, is a little reticent. He gives a fake name, and then he says this. I had the idea while imagining all the things Jen's therapist might have said about me, which possibly contributed to our breakup. And I thought, instead of all this solo theorizing, why don't I find out what a therapist would say to someone like Jen going out with someone like me? I'll imagine what Jen said about me and ask the therapist for advice. Not an entirely normal thing to do, sure, but I have no one else left to talk to, and all my tokens are spent anyway. And I still need answers. The Jen inquiry is an ongoing case. That is not what therapy is for. That is not how therapy works. I don't think, I mean, sure, maybe Jen's therapist is very like action oriented and maybe said some things about Andy that convinced her to leave him. But this male kind of self-absorption and this idea that like, obviously they're spending all of their time thinking about me and I'm going to get some answers. It just spoke in kind of a nice, subtle way with a lot of humor about this kind of very male sense of maybe what is going on in therapy. We also had some excellent sort of notes of physicality. There's a lot of excellent sort of blocking and a lot of excellent physicality. You see these bodies and you see them in space. And this next passage I'm going to read is a perfect example of that. And a lot of that sort of adds to the maleness that I felt in the book. So on 211, we have this. This is when he's meeting with Emery, who's a bit of a foil for him. We're going to get to that. Emery is very successful in his comedy career, where Andy is not so successful. We're going to talk about foils in a moment, but this is one of the pairs of foils that we're going to look at. Okay, so Emery says this. "How are you? You're looking very gaunt. Are you okay?" He hops up from the table and walks toward me, massaging my shoulders in a way that is physically relaxing but socially uncomfortable. I pat his hand to indicate that I want him to stop, and I take a seat in front of one of the mirrors. So I love this idea in a way that is physically relaxing but socially uncomfortable. That is the kind of observation that Alderton makes again and again, and it is so funny and so concise and so, I mean, that's like these adverbs, which generally are not that great, and they're kind of tucked in the middle of this whole thing, and I love how parallel they are. I love how funny this is, but they really speak to this idea of like, it felt really good that his comrade in comedy is giving him a shoulder rub, but it's socially awkward, so he has to pat his hand and be like, okay, dude, that's enough. So it's that kind of observation that I found so compelling. I will also say, again, I believe she grew up with no brothers and viewed boys and men as like this crazy kind of, like wild creatures. It is so impressive to me how well she has gotten all of their interactions down. The thing that she does too is, of course, we have Andy because he is our protagonist, he is our main character, but she also has a bunch of differentiated men. We have Morris, we have Avi. These are people who have voices that sound very different from his. I mean, obviously I'm talking about their verbiage, not their, we can't actually hear them in the book, but their voices, that it's very difficult to do that. It's difficult to write voices that sound different on the page, and she absolutely does it. So it's not even just like the one guy. She's got this whole, array of men. Emery sounds very different on the page. I keep, I'm sort of stepping on all my foils here. I'm presenting them a little bit early. A foil simply being, usually it's a complement in the sense of complementary, in the sense of two parts fitting together. But in order to be an effective foil, they have to have a lot in common and yet have something that is very different. So when I just was talking about Emery and Andy, Emery is like incredibly great looking and he's got this incredible head of hair and he's this incredibly successful comedian. So in lots of ways, he and Andy, they're both males, they're both comedians, they're good friends, they're coming up together in the comic world. But Emery has significantly more hair and also significantly more success. So in many ways, he is a foil than do these other men. So I just think she did such a good job with the male narrator. We're going to talk now about the prose in the novel. So this is a prose. I loved the writing in this book. It was so thoroughly convincing and so compelling. And it was a real page turner for me, especially when we got toward the end, which we're going to talk about. This is not writing, it's not like writing in Percival Everett's James, where it's doing this incredibly complex and sort of chameleonic thing that's just like really innovative and impressive and surprising. It's also not like Álvaro Enrigue's You Dreamed of Empires. Those are books that are doing things on the kind of verbal level and structurally that are innovative and interesting. This is not quite like that, but all the more credit to it because it is so compelling and has so many excellent points. So one of the things I really loved, there were all these Britishisms throughout. One of them was that a lot of the spelling, not a lot, but the word analyze, for example, was spelled with an S instead of a Z. I love it when presumably they changed a lot of the spellings, not a lot, but like they changed a bunch of the spellings. I don't know why they left that one. Maybe it was the only one. Maybe they didn't change them. But I really do love coming across those British spellings. Also, there were a bunch of things where she would talk about something and I'd be like, I don't know what that is. Usually it was like an object or something, or it was like something to eat, but sometimes it wasn't. It was something kind of more, it was more complex and more like significant than that. And I'd be like, I don't know what that is. And I love it. I think in some ways because we all speak English and because we are a former colony, of the empire, we have this idea that we're all kind of exactly the same when obviously we are not. And I like thinking about those differences. And I like thinking about like this tiny island, off of the coast of Europe versus like this gigantic country across the Atlantic. I'm interested in those differences. So I love it when you can actually see the gap, when you can really feel the difference either in language and in spelling, in terms of usage, in terms of structure and syntax. And I think lots of times they will like kind of Americanize these books. And I'm very happy that there were a bunch of times when that did not happen in good material. I think it was part of the charm, for sure. I said earlier that we were going to talk about figurative language. So this is one of those things. When I talk about figurative language, it simply means anytime that language is doing something other than like what the words actually say. So a lot of this is just a comparison. So it'll be a metaphor or a simile. Those are both comparisons. Metaphor does not use the word like or as. Simile does. They're almost exactly the same for all intents and purposes. Figurative language can also be things like foreshadowing or symbolism. It's kind of all that stuff that you learned like in sophomore English and may have forgotten about. And sometimes it can be heavy-handed, and that is honestly, I think, the worst. Like, I'm just like, oh God, if you're not great at these metaphors and similes, don't do them. Like, this is not a prereq. You don't have to have symbolism and foils and dramatic irony. But when Dolly Alderton has figurative language, it's usually great. So I want to talk briefly and slightly more generally about these kinds of comparisons and when they're successful and when they're not. So the whole reason to have a metaphor or a simile, any kind of comparison, is to help your readers see things or understand them more clearly. The way that this works best is if the compared objects are sort of like a little bit far apart, but not so far apart that the reader's like, what? So we're going to take a look here at some of the really excellent figurative language, and I'm going to just harken back to that very opening thing about the sinewy pinata. I think the idea of his heart being a pinata is not a bad idea, like in terms of it being kind of pummeled. I like that vision in some ways, but the sinewy pinata, I was like, what? But we have on pages 64, 65, and 66, we have like a weird number of similes all in a row. So we're going to take a look at them on 64, 65, and 66. So this is Andy's voice. It's such a delight to go back and look at this prose too, because all of it just really showcases the excellent way that she is voicing this narrator. Okay, so on 64, I go to the toilet and feel uncharacteristically livid at them all. I want to lash out with my pain to force them into acknowledging what I'm going through. I want to take my mangled breakup in my mouth and drop it in front of them like a cat bringing in a bloodied mouse from the garden. So I like this. I think it's like kind of in some ways, the feline thing to me seems like weirdly, I don't know why that seems kind of female oriented. I think that's kind of one of these things, like we tend to think of feline as being slightly more female. See, I'm looking for ways in which Dolly Alderton's like gender is informing this. And I think I'm kind of reaching there. I think that's probably not a great observation, but I do like this idea. I want to take my mangled breakup in my mouth. So this idea of it being mangled, that to me is very, it's really evocative, and we don't know exactly what the simile is going to be yet. And she says, and drop it in front of them like a cat bringing a bloodied mouse from the garden. I like the violence of it. I like the quotidian nature. It's so easy to relate to. So this is a rather, it's a rather involved metaphor, in fact. This idea of taking it in his mouth and the mouse and the cat. And that can be dangerous because if you get kind of too far along in these things and the reader's like, wait, what? That is not effective. But this, I think, was very good. And then right across the page, we have this. I imagine Jen and her best friends in fluffy white robes, lounging in a large suite, drinking wine, talking in that way I'd sometimes overhear Jen and her friends talking to each other when they came round to our flat, each taking turns to present an emotion they've felt, and all of them putting it under the microscope for inspection, as if it were a gem with a billion faces. So this was not quite as successful for me. First of all, it's a bit of mixed. If you had a loop, if you had the I don't know, maybe they put gems under microscopes, but in my very limited experience of gems, you have that little thing, that little glass thing that the jeweler might look at the gem through. I don't think it's like a microscope. This idea of having the emotion and passing it around, I do like that. And even that's figurative. I mean, they're obviously not taking an emotion and passing it around. But you have the beginning of the metaphor, which is very successful. And then the microscope for inspection, I liked that. I was like, okay, yeah. And then when we get to as if it were a gem with a billion faces, I like the faces part as opposed to facets, because I think it reminds us of all of the people. It also reminds us of this idea of being kind of two-faced, this idea of different people's truths. I like the faces part. I also think a billion faces, like I was like, wait, no gem has a billion faces. So I was getting very picky, but I often think like, as you are a reader and you're reading through, this figurative language probably didn't even register for you. But I can tell you that if it's not great, it's going to pull your reader out of the novel. And as soon as that happens, you're in real trouble. So again, I'm being very picky here. And these were figurative language. It actually worked fairly well for me, but it was a little bit too far in a sense that made me sort of pull up and think about it a bit. Then on 66, this I think is an excellent metaphor. I love everything about this. How could I have let myself believe, even for a second, that single 30-something life would be an endless buffet of opportunities when I know it is, at best, small plates? I love this. It just seemed the perfect thing for him to be thinking about. I like the idea of how it has to do with kind of appetite, like sexual appetite and gluttony, and this idea of a buffet and how overwhelming a buffet can be, and then this idea of small plates, and small plates as being very specific in time, very kind of millennial / Gen Z, maybe. Pretty firmly millennial, I think. But I love this. This is the kind of thing, this is kind of her bread and butter, no pun intended. This is usually the way that her figurative language works, and it is so, so good. Okay, and then I want to take a look at dramatic irony. Dramatic irony is simply when the reader has information that someone in the novel or the play does not. So it largely comes, as you might imagine, from drama, from plays. And a lot of plays function this way. You have characters on the stage and they're doing something, and so you are a witness to it as the audience, and then they leave and someone else comes on and they don't know what has just happened. So as the reader, or as the audience member, you're witnessing something and you have information that the characters do not have. I love dramatic irony. It is so fun and so effective when it's good. And there are entire novels that are built on it. We didn't have a lot of it, but I felt like it was so effective and funny. This book is so funny. It's funny in my favorite way because it's very poignant, but there is a lot of humor. And I loved these dramatic irony moments because they, in fact, seemed very funny to me. This is at the very end on page 312. This is when Jen is watching his stand-up and is kind of giving the reader kind of a play-by-play. And I loved this. The idea of the routine as kind of this distillation of these different points in the novel. It's not only fun to kind of recap the whole thing, it's so satisfying that again, this good material of the title it is really being processed before us. And we are not only, led to believe that Andy is going to have this positive experience with all of this good material. It is in fact good material, but we actually like it. We are getting to witness it and to see it, and we feel like we've kind of been along for the ride in a way that is very satisfying. So Jen has this description. Ringing his first girlfriend and trying to organize a meetup, buying every bottle of perfume in the local Boots and throwing them in the canal so there were a few less chances of being reminded of me. Surely that story was made up, or at least exaggerated. So this is in a parentheses at the end. We have this little parenthetical. Surely this story was made up or at least exaggerated, ? Close parentheses. So I loved that. You have this idea. We're like, oh my gosh, yeah, remember that time when he went and bought all of the Armani She and he threw it in the river. And it's very effective in part because we're like, oh my gosh, look, Andy has come so far and that's great. And then we have this hilarious little parentheses where she is like, surely these stories have to be exaggerated. And we know as the reader, they're not exaggerated. I mean, they're also total fiction, but it's kind of this thing where you're like, nope, not exaggerated. Like that stuff actually happened. And I like the kind of meta thing there too. I mean, this is a comedy routine, which is inside a novel. All of it is made up, but it ends up feeling so real because you as the reader witnessed it, and then you're seeing it turn into this material. I just find everything about that so appealing. And the last thing I'm going to touch on here very briefly in terms of the prose and in terms of figurative language in particular is this presence of foils. I loved it. I thought the foils were so good. It was a really, there are lots of them, and I found them very compelling. And sometimes it can be kind of too heavy-handed, and it never is with Dolly Alderton, which is great. So we have Jane and Jen. Love that their names are so similar. We have Andy and Avi, whose names also are somewhat similar. So these are people who in many ways resemble each other. They're friends. They've sort of come up in the same circumstances, but two of them are very dedicated to domesticity, and two of them, well, we're not sure about Andy, but Jen is definitively not at this point in her life. So you have these very effective ways that they are both similar and different. The last one I will mention is Andy and John, and I thought this was such an excellent element of the novel. I didn't really love the use of the like email. I think it's formatted differently, and it's a letter that Andy writes to John, and it's very sweet because he's like, oh, an actual Dear John letter. So we have John, of course, who has broken up with his girlfriend, or whose girlfriend has broken up with him, importantly. And so we have him beginning where Andy was before. It allows us to see how far Andy has come. It allows Andy to process a lot of that stuff, and for Andy to realize that he's come a long way. So it's another way that all of this is being synthesized, but it's this excellent foil that we have too. I also love the fact that she's talking here about a universal experience. I mean, people end relationships all the time. So you have this sense that Andy is not so particular and Jen is not so particular. I mean, these are not people who are like, incredibly different from all of their peers. They are, in fact, in many ways very similar to their group of friends. So the idea of John and his girlfriend having ended their relationship speaks to the fact that this is very universal. And I liked the way we don't know what the motivations of the girlfriend are, of John's girlfriend. But I like the idea of not knowing that. And, if I were a young reader who was reassessing her goals and her life journey because of Dolly Alderton, maybe I would imagine her as another person who in her early 30s is like, actually, no, thank you. I don't want to be married and I don't want to have children. I want something else out of my life. Someone could certainly read John's girlfriend in that capacity. And there were a couple of moments that really struck me in the book, and I wanted to touch on them briefly. Both of them are spoken by Jane. So Jane, in lots of ways, is a foil for Jen. So Jen and Jane, I love that Alderton basically gave them the same name. They are absolutely foils for one another, and I really appreciated them. So Jane is someone who is going to have her third child. She is someone who it seems very satisfied within reason and in a very realistic and kind of ambivalent way, really seems invested in her life as a woman who is very committed to marriage and to children and wants to have this large family and came from a large family. She's someone who is like sort of your archetypal domestic maternal figure. So in many ways, she is the perfect foil for Jen. And it is very meaningful and I think very sweet that we have Jane making these very astute observations about Jen that are very important. One comes fairly early in the novel and one comes very late. But this is the kind of thing, it doesn't take more than a couple of sentences to make such a large impact. Also, of course, we have the entire figure of Jen. We have her entire character and her character arc, which I think is very inspiring in many ways and really is subverting this whole idea of the marriage plot and the idea of rom-com in general. But I really love the fact that Jane is articulating this in two ways. I have little asterisks and I'm just like, it's all, I have a box around this text. And these 2 points, again, one at the beginning and one at the end, these sort of bookends, really stood out to me. One is on 43. So this is when Andy is talking to Jane and doesn't really have a great handle on why the breakup happened. He sort of has this one narrative for what happened, and Jane is pushing against it a little bit. So Andy says, did I ever fantasize about being single? Sure I did. But the point is, relationships are challenging and boring and annoying, and that's unavoidable. You have to work through it. You can't just opt out of the whole thing. You've never been single, though. Jen's been single most of her life until she met you, Jane says. So maybe she really does just want to be on her own. Maybe there isn't a big lie. So I love the fact that the way Andy is characterizing relationships up above, he says they're challenging and boring and annoying, and it's unavoidable. So I think for a lot of people, that would be the thing. Like, you're like, it's not great to be married, but like, that's what's going to happen because that's what people do. It's not even that he has any kind of illusions. It's just that he's sort of committed to this thing. It's what he knows. It's what he seems to want. It's where he is comfortable. But it's not a great endorsement of what it is to be married. I mean, this is not a good picture. And then the more important thing, of course, is that we have Jane very clearly seeing that Jen had been largely single. She has this relationship with Andy, which in lots of ways was great. But we learn later that in lots of ways it was stifling for her. And it wasn't, in fact, what she wanted. And very clearly, we have this idea, maybe she really does just want to be on her own. Maybe there isn't a big lie. So, of course, when people break up and then there's the whole like, it's me, it's not you, or like, I just want to be single for a while, or I can't really commit to something. I mean, people see those as, and often, they can be like kind of a kind way to let someone down easy. But also like, it's so subversive to think that like, that's maybe just what Jen wants. And it takes her a while, I think, to come to terms with the fact that maybe it's fine. But when we get to the end of the novel on 309, we have this beautiful sort of distillation, this beautiful articulation of the same idea again at the end of the novel, so a bookend. And I love the fact that this is also Jane speaking. So in many ways, she is a foil for Jen, but also they really understand each other. And so I think it's like extra meaningful to come from someone who really knows Jen, but also really knows domesticity and really has a sense about how different Jen's world might be, but also how great Jen's world might be. She says this, "Jesus fucking Christ, don't have a kid or get married because you're worried about being alone," she said, rubbing my back. I sat upright in my chair and she held me by my shoulders. "Be alone, Jen. You know how to be alone without being lonely. Do you know how rare that is? Do you know how much I wish I could do that? It's a wonderful thing you've got going on here." It's so excellent. It's really such a beautiful way, again, to subvert this marriage plot, which is really important on kind of a literary sense. But far more importantly, this is a message that is so powerful. If you're not comfortable in relationships and you're not lonely, then why on earth would you go ahead and try to be in a relationship that is not comfortable for you? I found it so inspirational. There's one last pair that are kind of like a foil. They're not exactly a foil, but this is a very important piece of the novel for me, and I just wanted to mention it. And I think it sort of fits in this foil discussion, which is Jen and her granny. So this is a woman who was, in a very like strictly domestic situation, but someone who was really chafing at it, and someone who articulates that to Jen, in this very poignant way right before she dies. So I'm not sure you think of them as foils. I mean, you kind of can. They're women, who, in domestic settings who have certain expectations of them, and they are members of the same family. But they're not quite foils the way the rest of them are. But I loved the way that the grandmother articulated this. So it was very important to me on some level to understand, the sort of fate that Jen is maybe getting to avoid, and also to look at the ways in which, all of these young women in the book work. They're all very successful. Not all of them, but they're very successful. I think at one point Jane is talking about how she's going to get to go back to work. So these are women who are not, it's not that they're like stuck in domesticity and having to sort of give up any sort of professional aspirations. That's not what's happening. But I loved this idea of taking a look at a grandparent who really didn't have an option, and then looking at Jen, who in fact has one, and to know that even in that sort of committed domestic situation where the grandmother found herself, the real desire there was not to stay in that domestic setting. The desire was to get out of the domestic setting. That was not a possibility for her, but it is a possibility for Jen. So I loved the way that was articulated toward the end. And I also found it a very convincing way to sort of explain why it is now, or then, why it is then that Jen has decided to leave Andy, why things become more clear for her. I thought it was so well done. Okay, I want to talk very briefly about the close, and then I'm going to hit you with my hot take. So the close of the novel, it is not, in fact, a double ending. I mean, in my mind, a double ending would have to be like two totally discrete endings. It was an ending, though, that to me felt a little bit like the ending of You Dreamed of Empires by Álvaro Enrigue, which is a very different book about the meeting of Hernán Cortés and Moctezuma. But there's this kind of, you're at the very end, you don't have many pages left, and you read what you think might be the end of the novel, although, of course, I have always clocked, the exact number of pages. If you're reading this electronically, I don't know how you do that. But so I knew that there was a bit more. But even at the very, very end of You Dreamed of Empires, there is an ending of sorts, and it is an ending, it feels very much like the novel is finishing, and then there's kind of this second re-envisioning of what might happen, and it is so satisfying. I mean, I hope I don't think I spoiled anything. Maybe. Oh my gosh. But I really enjoyed this idea of this sort of dual ending in some ways. So in Good Material, we have Andy's perspective and we have his voice and whatnot, and we're following him throughout for really the vast majority of the book. Then we switch to Jen's voice, and that's also very satisfying. And the novel finishes still in Jen's voice. It's very important to me that she has the last word. It's very important to me that we don't somehow switch back to Andy. Of course, we're seeing Andy, and we are given all sorts of indications. His agent's very pleased and people want to sign him, and you have this sense that he has had this real professional breakthrough. So you have a good sense of kind of what his life is going to be like moving ahead. I also, by the way, at one point, Jen talks about how she's always had this huge crush on Emery, and there's lots of energy when Emery comes over to congratulate Andy at the very end there. And part of me was like, ooh, if an author at the end of a book is going to sort of plant some seeds to allow you to envision how this person's life is going to be. My sense is yeah, she's going to go to South America and she's going to have all sorts of adventures, but I don't know, maybe she and Emery, maybe that's going to be a thing. Who knows? Also, I mean, listen to me. That is so societally conditioned. Also, I'm a romantic person. But why does she need a boyfriend? Why that? I apologize. I apologize to all of you out there listening. Honestly, maybe she goes to South America and maybe her job, I don't know, maybe who knows what happens. Maybe she lives in South America forever in a tiny village and loves it. Or maybe she comes back and works and she's an incredibly successful person in her job. Maybe she wants to have children eventually and has children on her own. I don't know what's going to happen with Jen, but I am appalled at the fact that one of the things, I don't know, maybe it's not appalling that I want her to have, someone who she's madly in love with. Maybe it's a fling. Frankly, Emery does seem like the kind of guy you would have a fling with, not in fact a life partner. So now that I've walked through all of that toward the ending, the ending is very rich. She's not tying things up with a bow exactly, but she's really given us a lot of ribbon here so we can tie our own bows in a way that is very satisfying. So I wanted to look at the very end. Again, I really like the idea of Jen as having the last word, and I really love the last word itself. So anytime you are reading even a sentence, certainly a paragraph, certainly a chapter, and obviously a book, the last word is incredibly important. It is the word toward which all of your kind of energy has been moving, even on the level of the sentence. You look at someone like Proust, or Virginia Woolf, where these sentences are so, elaborate. All of that energy, all of those clauses, all of the independence and dependence, all of that is leading us on some level toward this final word. You also usually have some sort of full stop. You have your period. And so for a second, that word kind of lingers for us. And so extra weight is put on that last word. In the case of the last word of a novel, obviously, it's hugely important. The word that it is not, it's not lingering for seconds. This is the word that is closing the entire novel. So I'm going to read it to you. I imagine you probably don't remember it. It's so well done. On page 315, we have Jen and Andy both, but we have this is Jen's voice in the first person here. He opens his arms and we hug. I wish him luck for all the shows in the run-up to Edinburgh, and we say we'll keep in touch, even though we know that we won't. We hold each other for a while, then we say goodbye. As I leave the pub, I look back to see him sitting down to talk to everyone who wanted to talk to him. I turn onto a street I don't know and make my way home alone. I love it. I love it. I love everything about this. I love the fact that she's turning onto a street. That's very metaphorical. She's on a new path. She's on a new road. It's a road she does not know. and she's going to make her own way. I make my way home. So there's this sense that her home, she has an established home. She is not someone who does not have a home. She doesn't need a relationship or other people to have a home. And then this idea of alone, and the idea of alone as being the final word. I make my way home alone. It's so strong. Dolly Alderton is so good. This book is so good. So now I'm going to hit you with my hot take, which is this. I kept wondering if this book was not modeled on Homer's Odyssey. So just hang on for a minute here. I don't know. I mean, God, I really would love to ask Dolly Alderton. I kind of imagine not, but that would be so cool. And it actually held up in a bunch of different ways. So here is this is a very good example of people who are reading literature and they're reading all sorts of stuff into it that isn't there. And I actually probably think that Dolly Alderton was not modeling good material on the Odyssey, but maybe, and either way, it doesn't matter at all. The reason why it's important is because it was super fun for me to look at all the ways, to take this incredibly important epic poem from whatever BC, just really one of the foremost kind of foundational texts in all of literature, for me to be able to have that in mind and be sort of mapping good material by Dolly Alderton onto the Odyssey was so fun. So, whatever, take it or leave it. You can just be like, that is so crazy. And it probably is crazy, but let me tell you, it was fun. So here are the parallels that I found. So obviously Andy would be, your sort of Odysseus. And in the Odyssey, he's moving from place to place and sort of famously has these different adventures. So he goes to the island at some point, and there are these lotus eaters. It's this group that's kind of narcotized and has been eating these lotus flowers and is sort of numb and sort of dissociated from everything. And on some level, I was like, okay, all of this debauchery when he and his friends go out and there's so much drinking and he can't remember things the next morning and he ends up in Avi and Jane's bed. That to me seemed a bit like a lotus eater sort of foray. Then we have Sophie. And Sophie, in many ways for me, felt like a sort of a Circe character. She also felt like she's kind of an amalgam in my mind, in my hot take here, of both Circe and all of the sirens and Calypso. So these are all people who are highly sexualized. They're nymphs. There's orgies. Literally, there are orgies in Dolly Alderton's book. There are also orgies in the Odyssey. So you have this idea of a younger person who is incredibly beguiling and who is very captivating and powerful in lots of ways, but also very difficult to understand, much like Circe and Calypso and the sirens. And in some ways, the siren song, this kind of impenetrable, totally ineffable captions for all the Instagram for Sophie, that's not exactly a siren song, but in some ways it sort of, it added to my theory. It added to my theory here. We also have Morris. So Morris is, this is a stretch, but I think he can be read kind of like a Tiresias. So Tiresias is he's a dweller in the underground, and he in the underworld. The underground sounds like the British, tube. But he's blind, but he's a seer. He's kind of a prophet. And so I think in many ways you can think of Morris as being sort of blinded by, he has these kind of weird conspiracy theories. I thought it was so sweet when Andy writes the letter as if it were from Julian Assange. And also when he invited Morris to his family Christmas. So there are lots of ways that this seer, this blind kind of prophet, this Morris character who is blinded in many ways and who is totally isolated, but he is in many ways, a cautionary tale for Andy. Andy's like, I don't know if I want to grow up to be like Morris. So in many ways, I had this sense of Tiresias and Morris as being a kind of parallel. That is probably a bit of a stretch. But here's the most important thing. If Dolly Alderton is, in fact, modeling a lot of what's happening in good material on the Odyssey, here's the part that's most genius. This is the part that I'm just like, oh my God, this is ingenious, is the fact that in the Odyssey, the whole entire time, Odysseus is trying to get back to his wife. He's trying to get back to Penelope. And she's at home and she's weaving, she's doing that weaving thing. And then at night she's unweaving, and then she's weaving during the day and unweaving at night. And she has all these suitors and they're all of these people. And his whole thing is that he has to get back to his wife. So this is this is an epic poem from whatever, a zillion years ago, that is really reinforcing the idea of the marriage plot. It doesn't all work out perfectly. It's not like a super happy ending for everyone. But it's so excellent that sort of the husband-wife relationship is so central in the Odyssey. And in many ways, Dolly Alderton is working really hard against that narrative. So I'm going to leave it at that. I'm just going to say that Dolly Alderton, she just like went up to the Odyssey here. I mean, she went for it. So I loved talking about this book. I hope that some of this was additive in terms of your experience of the book. I just loved everything about it. So make your way back to the Fox page, find something else to read. Happy reading.